I grew up in a small town in the middle of the United States. The town was called Pine Falls, and it was in the southern end of Missouri, right on the outskirts of the national forest. The town was quite unremarkable, but it was pleasant enough. Although it was on the smaller side, we never really wanted for much, as the town had mostly everything you'd need. Being located so close to a main highway and natural scenic attraction, we often saw our fair share of tourists passing through. Some of the denizens of the town were a bit indifferent towards the somewhat careless and brash travelers that drifted through. I, on the other hand, didn't mind them quite as much. After living in one place long enough, you almost develop a desire to reach past the familiar, just to see what lies beyond, even if that reach is just interacting with someone from the outside world. Towards the end of my high school life, I had gotten a part-time job at one of the few gas stations that marked the entry into our town. Kurt, a good friend of mine at school who was already working there, put in a good word for me with the boss, and before I knew it, I was working there on the weekends. The job was simple enough: stocking shelves and coolers, and punching a few buttons to activate the gas pumps. Throughout the summer, I worked during the afternoons, and got to interact with a bunch of various people passing through. A lot of them wouldn't stay longer than to tell me which pump they'd like money on, but if it was a slow day, a couple of the out-of-towners would sit and chat for a bit. I'd get to ask them where they were from and what brought them to the town. At first, I would only meet people from Missouri, families doing their nature getaways for the summer. But the longer I worked there, I encountered more tourists from much further away. Hell, I even got to meet a family from England who were doing an off-the-beaten-path trip across the United States. The reasoning behind most of the visitors were always the same, though. They wanted to see or pass through the national forest. It always struck me as sort of odd that people would travel great distances just to see a bunch of trees, when nature could easily be visible outside of a window. I guess that's just a product of growing up within such proximity to the forest. I spent a good majority of my youth playing with friends in those woods, that I eventually stopped seeing it as a large collection of nature, and instead just seeing it as a grouping of trees. Nothing of note really happened in Pine Falls. If I'm remembering correctly, one year a famous rock band passed through and stayed at one of the bed and breakfasts closer to the forest, but aside from that, nothing major really occurred. One occasion did stick out as somewhat strange, however. Nearly 2 years before I left the town, while I was working at the gas station one evening, a large collection of black SUVs pulled into one of the pumps. One of the passengers stepped out and walked towards the doors. He opened them and stepped inside. The man was wearing a completely black suit with sunglasses, despite the rapidly dwindling sunset. I greeted the man and welcomed him to Pine Falls, but the man just stood at the entrance of the gas station. He glanced around the shelves, then over to me. I asked him if he was doing all right, but then he just turned around and walked back outside. The absurdity of their outfits reminded me of the men in black, and I couldn't help but chuckle quietly to myself. The man returned to his car, and all of them continued driving down the road towards the forest. It was such a bizarre and benign occurrence that I forgot about it shortly after. Around a year and a half passed, and my family was now relocating to the southeastern side of the country. My father had gotten a new job, and we were forced to uproot ourselves. The thought of moving didn't really excite me, but I was interested in a change of scenery. I bid my friends farewell, and once our things were packed, we moved on to our new home. This is where things start to get strange. I can't honestly recall when I forgot about Pine Falls, but I believe it was 2 or 3 years after we had moved. One day, I had just up and forgotten about my childhood town. It's hard to explain. I didn't notice I had forgotten because I wasn't actively trying to remember it, if that makes any sense. I do recall what triggered my memory of the town, though. I was commuting to work one morning a few months ago when I stopped for gas. As I was filling my car up, I noticed 3 black SUVs pull into the other vacant pumps. A couple of the passengers got out of the cars, and they were all wearing black suits with sunglasses. I chuckled as they reminded me of the men in black. Just then, a flash of memories nearly knocked me on my ass. I returned to my car and thought long about my past. I was confused as to how I had forgotten so much of it. It was such a strange sensation, because while I was now remembering Pine Falls, I also can recall the previous day where all those experiences seemed non-existent. I thought about it all day, and even took a few notes down on my phone to make sure I wouldn't forget again. When I got home that evening, I called my parents and asked my mother if she remembered Pine Falls. Her response was unsettling. She asked me if it was some TV show I used to watch when I was a kid. I told her no, and I thought for a moment before asking her where we lived before moving into our current house. She went silent for a few minutes before asking if I was all right. She said we always lived in the same town, but had to move so my father could be closer to work. I nearly dropped my phone when she said that. Thinking back to my past, I realized I now had 2 sets of memories. I had memories from living on the East Coast, and also memories of living in Pine Falls. The more I thought about it, the more my memories from living in my current town seemed to fade. She asked me again if I was all right, and I told her that I was just tired from work. I hung up shortly after, and immediately got on my computer. I began searching for any sign of Pine Falls, Missouri, and there was absolutely no record of that town ever existing. Feeling unsatisfied, I decided I would take some time off from work and go visit the town for myself. I'm not entirely sure why, but I think it was to verify that I wasn't actually losing my mind. The following week arrived, and I loaded up my car and began my trip. It took me nearly a day and a half of travel just to make it to Missouri. The closer I got, the more familiar the landscape became to me, and it wasn't long before I was on the same highway leading into Pine Falls itself. As I drew nearer to where I remembered the turnoff being, I noticed there were no signs whatsoever for Pine Falls. Oddly enough, there was still an exit in roughly the same area. It just had no signs identifying where it led to. I pulled off the highway and began following the road. The longer I drove, the more I recognized the surrounding area. It was then that I noticed a clearing off to the right-hand side of the road. As I rolled to a stop, I quickly got out of my car and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was the same exact spot where the gas station I worked at was supposed to be. Only it was completely gone. There was still some concrete, but it had long since been overgrown. I could feel my hands becoming clammy the longer I stood around there. Something about being there was making me nervous. I returned to my car and continued driving down the road. As I pulled into where the town was supposed to be, there was nothing. No buildings, no houses, no stores. Just a road with various clearings dotting the area. I was trying to think of how an entire town could just be removed like this. Hell, even the abandoned towns throughout the country leave some sort of sign. I pulled up to where my childhood house once stood and stopped on the road. I knew of the area because of a massive pine tree with a large hole sitting a few yards away. My friends and I used to light firecrackers and throw them in there when we were kids. I got out of the car and walked over to the area where the house once stood. It was utterly vacant of any signs of civilization. Then, suddenly, my cell phone rang out in my pocket, nearly giving me a heart attack. I quickly rifled it out and looked at who was calling me. At first, I didn't recognize the number, but something about it seemed strangely familiar. Then it hit me. The number belonged to Kurt, my friend who had gotten me a job at the gas station all those years ago. I knew it was his because of the last 4 digits. They were 1010. He used to joke saying it was because he was a 10 out of 10 in good looks. I held the phone in trembling hands as it rang over and over. Even if this was Kurt, there was no way he'd know I'd be here, at this time, at this exact spot. I wanted to cancel the call, but something drew me to hit the answer button. I pressed it and brought the phone up to my ear. For a few minutes there was silence, and then I asked if this was Kurt. When I did, a wailing cry began to shriek through the tiny speaker. It started off as just a single voice, calling out in agony. Then two. Then multiple voices screaming in pain. The sounds melded into a dissonant screech, and then, at its loudest, the line went silent. Dead. I looked around, unsure of what I had just experienced, and quickly returned to my car. I spun the car around and began driving back the way I came, all the way back home. During that drive, I thought about everything that had occurred since I began remembering Pine Falls. I had a million unanswered questions, like what happened to it? Where did it go? What happened to all the people who still lived there after I had left? And what was the deal with those men in suits? Did they have something to do with this? But the more I thought about it, the more I kept focusing on one question in particular. Why did my family and I forget about our past? Why did we forget the town? I have absolutely no idea what caused this, but it's terrifying to me. I wanted to write this all down as a way of remembering, because ever since I traveled to Pine Falls and back a second time, I can feel the memories of my past are growing fainter and fainter by the day.